Imagine a battlefield drenched in blood and smoke. Japanese soldiers, raised under the Bushido Code, believed capture meant dishonor and wounds meant certain death. They expected only pain, abandonment, and silence as their last moments. But what happened when they fell into American hands left them stunned beyond belief. Instead of bayonets, they saw bandages. Instead of a swift execution, they received morphine to ease their agony. Men who had been taught that mercy did not exist suddenly found themselves lying on stretchers, carried by enemy medics risking their own lives under fire. Some were stitched, others received blood transfusions, and many lived to see another day, something unthinkable in the brutal logic of the Pacific War. For countless Japanese soldiers, America's battlefield medical care was not just shocking. It was unimaginable, a glimpse of humanity in a war defined by destruction. World War II was not only a clash of armies but also a clash of cultures and values. For Japanese soldiers, the battlefield was a place where honor was measured in death, not survival. The Bushido Code demanded that a warrior fight until the last breath, and surrender was seen as the ultimate disgrace. Medical care for the wounded was limited, and many believed that suffering in silence was a duty rather than a tragedy. But when these same soldiers encountered American forces, they stepped into a reality they could never have imagined. The United States had created one of the most advanced battlefield medical systems the world had ever seen. Medics carried morphine, field hospitals were equipped for surgery, and blood plasma could be delivered even under fire. To the Japanese, it was as if the enemy had turned war into an unexpected place of healing. In this story, we will uncover how Japanese soldiers reacted when mercy came from the last place they expected, their enemy. What they discovered on the battlefield changed their view of war, honor, and even humanity itself. For Japanese soldiers in World War II, the battlefield was not just a place of fighting, it was a stage for sacrifice. From the moment they were drafted, they were taught that surrender was unthinkable. The Bushido Code, rooted in the ancient way of the samurai, demanded loyalty unto death. To be captured was worse than dying, for it meant shame not only upon the soldier but upon his entire family. This mindset shaped how Japanese soldiers faced every battle, believing that once they were wounded, their fate was sealed. Many carried grenades with the expectation of using them on themselves rather than falling into enemy hands. Others sharpened their bayonets for a final charge, even when their wounds made fighting impossible. Death was honorable, but survival under an enemy's mercy was not. It was drilled into them that Americans would never show compassion. Soldiers heard terrifying propaganda that the enemy would torture, mutilate, and laugh at their suffering. For the Japanese, mercy simply did not exist in the vocabulary of war. On the battlefield, they often witnessed comrades who chose suicide over capture. A wounded man might pull the pin of a grenade, ending his life in a flash of fire. Another might raise his rifle to his own head rather than risk dishonor. These scenes created an atmosphere where survival itself felt shameful. The expectation was simple: you fight until your last breath, and if you fall, you die with your weapon in hand. This belief shaped their every action. Even when shells tore through the air and bullets shredded the earth, Japanese soldiers fought on with the knowledge that they had only two possible outcomes: victory or death. There was no middle ground. And so, when they first encountered American medical aid, it struck them not only as unusual but as something entirely alien. How could an enemy who was supposed to be cruel risk his own life to save theirs? The shock was not just physical, it was cultural. A lifetime of training told them death was certain, yet here was life being offered instead. To the Japanese mind, it was not simply unexpected, it was incomprehensible. This clash of belief and reality would leave many Japanese soldiers questioning everything they thought they knew about honor, war, and the humanity of their enemy. While Japanese soldiers carried the expectation of death, the American military approached the battlefield with a radically different philosophy: every soldier's life was worth saving. The United States built a medical system during World War II that was unprecedented in scale, speed, and effectiveness. It was not perfect, but compared to what Japanese soldiers knew, it was nothing short of a miracle. At the front lines, medics were trained to move under fire, carrying only a red cross on their helmet as protection. Armed not with rifles, but with morphine syrettes, bandages, and plasma packs, they crawled through mud and bullets to reach the wounded. Their first priority was to stop bleeding, ease pain, and stabilize the soldier for evacuation. In many cases, they worked on Japanese prisoners of war with the same urgency as their own comrades, an act that astonished those who had been taught to expect cruelty. Behind the lines, the United States had developed a chain of medical evacuation known as the Golden Hour principle. Wounded soldiers could be carried from the battlefield to an aid station, then to a field hospital, and finally to a fully equipped surgical unit within hours. Trucks, jeeps, and even planes were used to move the injured as quickly as possible. For the first time in history, war was paired with a system designed not only to kill but also to save. One of the most groundbreaking tools was blood plasma. Portable plasma packs meant that soldiers suffering from shock or blood loss could be revived on the spot. Antibiotics like sulfa drugs and later penicillin reduced infection rates drastically, turning wounds that once guaranteed death into injuries that could heal. Field hospitals carried surgical equipment that allowed doctors to perform amputations, remove shrapnel, and even conduct complex operations in the middle of a war zone. For Japanese soldiers captured or wounded in combat, this system was unimaginable. Many of them expected to be left to die or executed. Instead, they were treated with morphine, stitched by skilled hands, and sometimes even transported alongside American wounded in the same vehicles. The shock of lying on a stretcher, being carried by enemy medics, was almost too much to comprehend. To the Americans, saving a life was not just a matter of compassion but of morale and principle. To the Japanese, it was a revelation. They had stepped into a world where war was still brutal, but humanity had not been abandoned. And in that world, their enemy was rewriting what it meant to fight, not only with weapons, but with mercy. Among the countless tales of the Pacific War, some of the most surprising come not from battles won or lost, but from the quiet moments after the fighting, when Japanese soldiers found themselves in the hands of American medics. These stories reveal the raw shock of men who had expected only death, yet instead encountered an enemy determined to save their lives. On Guadalcanal, one Japanese soldier lay bleeding in the jungle, shrapnel embedded in his chest. He had prepared himself for the end, clutching a grenade to his side. But when American Marines stumbled upon him, they didn't fire. Instead, they pried the grenade from his trembling hands, injected him with morphine, and carried him on a stretcher through mud and gunfire. Hours later, he opened his eyes in a tent where American surgeons were operating to remove the metal. That had nearly killed him. For the rest of his life, he would recall that moment as the day his image of the enemy shattered. In another case on Saipan, an American medic risked his life to save a Japanese teenager barely 16 years old. The boy had been shot through the leg and was drifting in and out of consciousness. Even as snipers fired from the hills, the medic tied a tourniquet, dragged him to cover, and applied sulfa powder to stop infection. The boy later admitted he had expected to be executed, but instead, he found himself recovering in a field hospital alongside men who, days earlier, had tried to kill him. POW camps added even more astonishing chapters. Captured Japanese soldiers received medical treatment that rivaled what American prisoners might expect. Some underwent major surgeries, amputations, chest operations, even dental extractions, all provided by the enemy they had been taught to despise. Letters smuggled back to Japan after the war revealed their disbelief. "The Americans heal our wounds as if we are their own," one soldier wrote, his words carrying both gratitude and confusion. For these men, the experience was not only life-saving but worldview-shattering. They had been raised on propaganda that painted Americans as merciless barbarians. Yet here were those same enemies, wiping their brows, stitching their wounds, and feeding them broth as they regained their strength. It was a contradiction so powerful that many Japanese soldiers carried it with them long after the war, a memory that haunted them more than the battles themselves. In those moments of care, the line between friend and foe blurred. What remained was something deeper, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion could still rise from the smoke of war. If the battlefield care shocked Japanese soldiers, what they encountered inside American POW camps left them completely bewildered. These camps, scattered across the Pacific and even within the United States, were not simply holding facilities. They became centers of unexpected mercy, where medicine, surgery, and even mental health support were extended to men who had once been sworn enemies. Inside these camps, captured Japanese soldiers found clean beds, stocked infirmaries, and doctors who treated them with the same professionalism given to American troops. Serious cases were taken straight to camp hospitals, where surgeons performed complex procedures. Amputations were done to save lives from gangrene, shrapnel was carefully extracted, and even lung operations were carried out in sterile conditions. For men who had grown up believing that death was the only escape from wounds, these surgeries were nothing short of miraculous. Dental care was another surprise. Many Japanese soldiers, who had suffered years of neglect and malnutrition, suddenly found themselves seated in dental chairs, receiving fillings, extractions, and treatment for infections. For a culture that placed little emphasis on preserving the health of prisoners, the sight of an enemy cleaning their teeth and saving their jaws was almost laughable, and yet profoundly humbling. The care extended beyond physical wounds. American doctors also addressed psychological trauma. Some Japanese prisoners, broken by the horrors of combat, received what we would now call psychiatric support. They were encouraged to rest, to speak of their experiences, and to rebuild their mental strength. Though primitive by today's standards, this compassion was unheard of in Japanese military culture, where emotional pain was a sign of weakness. Nutrition and rehabilitation programs went hand in hand with medical care. Prisoners received balanced meals that helped them recover from starvation diets. Some were even given light work or recreational activities to regain physical strength after surgery. To their astonishment, Japanese POWs often gained weight, healed faster, and lived longer in American captivity than they might have as active soldiers in the field. Letters and memoirs written after the war reveal their astonishment. Many admitted they could not comprehend why their enemy would invest so much effort into keeping them alive. Some confessed a deep sense of shame, realizing that their own country would never have done the same for captured Americans. Others expressed gratitude so profound that it stayed with them for the rest of their lives. In those camps, the line between conqueror and captive blurred once again. What Japanese soldiers discovered was not only medical treatment but a shocking reversal of everything they had been taught. The enemy was not a monster, he was a healer. For Japanese soldiers, the physical healing was astonishing, but the deeper wound was psychological. Nothing in their training, their culture, or their propaganda had prepared them for the experience of mercy from an enemy. The result was a storm of confusion, disbelief, and even shame that haunted many long after the war had ended. From childhood, Japanese boys were taught that the enemy was cruel, savage, and incapable of compassion. They were told that to surrender was to invite humiliation, torture, and certain death. Yet when American medics cleaned their wounds, changed their bandages, and spoke words of comfort, those carefully built illusions collapsed. The shock was so great that many prisoners struggled to accept the reality in front of them. Some attempted to rationalize it. Perhaps the Americans are only keeping us alive for experiments, one soldier wrote in his diary. Others thought it was a trick, that kindness today would lead to cruelty tomorrow. But as days turned into weeks, and their bodies genuinely recovered, the truth became undeniable: the enemy had chosen to save their lives. Letters written home, when censorship allowed, captured this disbelief. One Japanese prisoner described lying in a hospital bed after surgery, astonished that American nurses wiped his forehead and offered him soup. "I feel ashamed," he confessed, "for we would never treat them this way." Another wrote that being spared and healed by the enemy made him question whether his own country valued life at all. For many, the shame cut even deeper than the wounds. Survival itself became a burden. They had been taught that living as a prisoner was dishonorable, yet here they were, alive because of American compassion. Some feared returning home, worried that their families would see them as cowards. Others struggled to reconcile their sense of duty with the reality that their lives had been preserved by men they were supposed to hate. This cultural conflict became one of the most profound consequences of America's medical system. It didn't just heal bodies, it challenged identities. By refusing to mirror the brutality expected of them, Americans forced Japanese soldiers to confront the limits of their own code of honor. For some, this planted seeds of resentment. For others, it opened the possibility that humanity could exist even in war. In those quiet hours on hospital beds and in prison barracks, Japanese soldiers faced a truth more powerful than any weapon. The enemy they had demonized was, in many ways, more merciful than their own commanders. And that realization changed them forever. To the Japanese, America's endless medical care seemed almost supernatural. But there was method and purpose behind it, a combination of practicality, strategy, and principle that shaped how the United States fought the war. America's investment in medical care was not an accident, it was a deliberate choice that revealed how the nation viewed both its soldiers and its role in the world. First and foremost was morale. Every American soldier who marched into battle knew that if he fell, there was a strong chance he would be saved. This knowledge gave men courage to fight, reassured families back home, and built a trust between troops and their leaders. A soldier might risk everything on the front lines because he believed that if he was wounded, his country would not abandon him. In contrast, Japanese soldiers, who expected no such mercy, often faced despair the moment they were injured. Second was strategy. Every soldier saved was one less man that had to be replaced, one more body that could potentially return to service. Trained troops were valuable, and preserving life meant preserving fighting strength. The rapid system of evacuation and treatment allowed America to recycle manpower that might otherwise have been lost forever. In a war fought across oceans, where resources were stretched thin, this was a decisive advantage. There was also humanity. Many American doctors and medics believed deeply in the Hippocratic Oath, the duty to heal regardless of nationality. This principle extended even to enemy prisoners. Saving a life was seen as a moral obligation, not simply a military one. While propaganda often painted the Japanese as ruthless, American soldiers discovered that their own values compelled them to act differently. To let an enemy bleed out when care was possible was seen by many as a betrayal of the very ideals they fought to defend. Finally, there was propaganda value. Images of American doctors treating wounded prisoners sent a powerful message, both to allies and enemies. It showed the world that the United States represented something higher than raw brutality, that it fought not only with bombs and guns but also with compassion. These stories spread, often carried home by Japanese prisoners themselves, and became living proof that America stood for principles beyond conquest. For Japanese soldiers, this layered approach, blending morale, strategy, humanity, and propaganda, was almost impossible to comprehend. Yet for the United States, it was simple: a strong army required strong men, and a just cause required mercy even toward those who opposed it. The war eventually ended, but for countless Japanese soldiers who had experienced American medical care, the memories never faded. These moments of mercy became part of their lifelong reflections, reshaping how they viewed not only the enemy but also their own nation and culture. Some former prisoners returned to Japan with stories that shocked their families. They described operations done with care, wounds dressed daily, and nurses who treated them with dignity. For relatives who had been told Americans were monsters, these accounts were nearly impossible to believe. Yet they came from men who had lived through it, men who owed their survival to the compassion of their captors. Such testimonies quietly undermined the myth of the heartless enemy that Japan's wartime propaganda had worked so hard to build. Others, however, struggled deeply. To survive captivity was already considered shameful, but to survive because of enemy mercy cut even deeper. Many wrestled with guilt, feeling they had betrayed the Bushido code by living when so many comrades had chosen death. For some, this shame was unbearable, and they rarely spoke of their experiences, even to family members. Silence became their way of coping with the contradiction of survival through compassion. Yet there were also those who allowed the experience to transform them. These men saw America not only as a powerful military opponent but as a nation that carried principles their own commanders had ignored. For them, survival became a reminder that humanity could exist even in the darkest of times. Some went on to share their stories publicly, hoping to build bridges of understanding between former enemies. The legacy also extended beyond individuals. In the post-war years, Japan's medical system underwent rapid modernization, influenced in part by American practices witnessed during the war. Japanese doctors and nurses learned new techniques, from battlefield surgery to the use of antibiotics, many of which had first been seen by soldiers treated in POW camps. In this way, the compassion shown to prisoners rippled forward into Japan's future. The clash of cultures, between Bushido's demand for death and America's insistence on saving life, became one of the defining contrasts of the Pacific War. For Japanese soldiers, it was a shock that never fully left them. For the world, it became proof that even in a conflict defined by brutality, moments of humanity could change hearts, minds, and nations. In the end, the bandages, blood plasma, and surgical knives of American medics left a legacy as enduring as the bullets and bombs. Where destruction sought to erase life, compassion ensured that memory, gratitude, and transformation survived. World War II is often remembered for its battles, its destruction, and its staggering loss of life. Yet hidden within its brutality are stories that defy the very logic of war, stories of mercy offered where none was expected. For Japanese soldiers, America's battlefield medical care was one of those revelations. What began as shock on the front lines grew into a lifetime of questions about honor, humanity, and the true meaning of strength. For some, the sight of an enemy medic crawling under fire to bind their wounds was more unforgettable than the clash of tanks or the roar of artillery. It forced them to confront the possibility that their enemy was not defined by cruelty but by a kind of compassion they had never known in their own ranks. For others, the shame of survival gnawed at them, a reminder that they had lived because of kindness rather than sacrifice. In either case, the impact was profound. The legacy of America's medical system was more than just saved lives. It became a living testimony that even in humanity's darkest moments, principles mattered. To treat the enemy with dignity was not weakness, it was a declaration of values. The stretcher, the syringe, and the surgeon's steady hand became as powerful as the rifle and the bomb. For today's audience, these stories remind us that history is not only about destruction. It is also about the choices people made in the midst of chaos. The Japanese soldiers who lived because of American mercy carried a truth that still echoes: compassion can wound as deeply as violence, but in the best way possible, it reshapes how we see one another. In the end, war is meant to strip men of their humanity. But America's endless medical care proved the opposite. Even on battlefields littered with death, humanity could survive. And for those Japanese soldiers who opened their eyes in American hospitals instead of dying in the mud, it was a lesson they would never forget, that sometimes the most powerful weapon in war is mercy itself.